Hey dudes, it's Lerald. Path of Exile 2's economy is in a very weird state right now. The value of Exalted Orbs is absolutely plummeting, and so I wanted to try a strategy that involved something other than blasting rares and maps and picking up thousands of pennies. I also didn't want to gamble on in-game boss uniques, so I juiced up 100 map bosses in this big, beautiful valley that I have here, and as you can see, it's got tons of overlapping towers. Before I arrived, it had tons of map bosses in it as well. So I killed 100 bosses, and I'm going to be talking about how good and profitable boss killing is as a farm strategy. So let's get into it. Alright, so right off the bat, why map bosses? Patch 0.1.1 introduced a new type of tablet into the game, the Overseer's tablet, which adds bosses onto surrounding maps. It can roll anywhere from 3 to 7 maps in range, getting bosses added, right? And prior to the early access release, Mark and Jonathan spent a lot of time emphasizing that map bosses would be much more rewarding in PoE 2. They would also be like harder fights. They gave them their own in-game Atlas passive tree, and so they said they wanted them to be less common, around 1 in every 4 maps. Prior to patch 0.1.1, it was actually more like 1 in every 8 or 10 maps, but that patch fixed that so that they actually appear in the correct number of maps. I felt like that and the tablet was enough of a justification for making a targeted farm strategy focusing on bosses to test whether they are good or bad, and really just kinda to see how they compare with strategies like Breach and Ritual, League mechanics if you will. Essentially, I was asking the question, are bosses the 5th League mechanic? And I kind of think they are. Now, just to be clear, I am specifically only talking about and considering the 100 bosses. I didn't have high hopes for them to be very rewarding, but I figured they would at least be quick, and they definitely were. Bosses only take about 15 to 20 seconds for me to kill on average, and I'm including, like, from the time I start walking into their room, wait on their activation animation, instantly murder them, and then wait for them to drop their items. I would say 20 seconds is kind of a high estimate. But there is one massive exception, the Crowbell fight. That boss has several very long invulnerability phases, and so he takes about 90 seconds. Because of that, and just to err on the side of caution, I've estimated my time per boss to be around 30 seconds each. This is a pretty big factor that you absolutely must consider when thinking about map bosses and comparing them to mechanics like Breach or Ritual. Breach will generate more currency per map, on average, than a map boss. Of course it will. It has a bunch more rares in it than one map boss, but the Atlas is infinite and your time is not. So in terms of map setup, I moved around this entire valley, completing maps in the area and making my way to towers and then putting specific tablets into them. So the kind of tablets I was looking for were tablets that had this prefix here, increased quantity of items found in your maps. I used that in every single tablet spot on all of those towers with one exception. I had one tablet that looked like this, and it was perfectly rolled. It was 20% rarity in your maps and 25% rarity on your map bosses. I used that one in one tower, and I actually did find a divine in that radius, so, maybe rarity is actually pretty good, but all the rest of them, I was looking for quantity of items found in the maps as a prefix, and then kind of whatever as a suffix. I didn't use Overseer tablets in every single one of the towers. I used them in probably about half, and then for the other half, I just kind of used just whatever. Good tablets, things like quantity of items and, quantity of waystones, or just quantity of items and some sort of league mechanic, like Breach or Delirium or Expedition or whatever. Now, as for the maps themselves, I ran tier 15 and tier 16 maps with quantity. Maps like this one, they would have quantity and then whatever else on them, and delirious annoyance. So I anointed every map that I could, much like this map, with paranoia, so I would get 45% increased number of rare monsters. Some of them dropped pre-anointed, and so they just kind of had whatever they had. This meant that all of the map bosses were getting the benefits of deliriousness being on the map, but for the most part, they weren't getting any other benefits. Like I wasn't using greed, for example, to give all of the maps increased rarity. That probably would have been a good idea. I'll kind of talk more about ideas, things I think I maybe would have changed, but that's probably one of them. Ultimately, I went with what I thought would give the most currency for the entire map, but that only counted the actual currency drops from the bosses. And then the final bit of setup here, this is my Atlas passive tree. I'll put a link to it in the description, but it's a pretty standard juicing tree. I came over and took Rising Danger for more rare mobs, Deadly Evolution for extra modifiers on rares and uniques. That does include map bosses. It also includes Delirium bosses. So this can make some of the map bosses a little harder, but It also makes them more rewarding. And then, Grueling Journey for more Waystone mod effect, Quant and Rarity from Lucky Pillage, potentially 25% more effective prefix mods out of Unstable Energies, more Quant and Rarity that way, Remnants of Power for more tablet effect, all of these small tablet nodes, and then an Enigmatic Intensification for more Waystone effect, and then finally Local Knowledge, since most of the maps I was doing were swamp biome for more currency or grass biome for more socket currency, and I did actually get a perfect jeweler's orb, although not from a boss, so I didn't count it, but I did get one. Felt nice. This is what my boss tree looks like. I took quantity of items dropped by map bosses and then, came all the way up to organized forces. These ones in the middle here, this like belt here, an extra shrine, an extra essence, an extra strongbox. This is all pretty much like irrelevant, like who cares, do whatever you want. Organized forces, making all the areas with map bosses get +1 to zone level is very good. I think that, it's at least pretty good, right? That way you can guarantee that all the area levels are at least area level 80. Beyond Reality, giving you only a 30% chance to have corruption and add another area level, but then potentially also add another random map mod. Could be good, could be terrible. I didn't really love this with the chance for it being so low. And then also the monsters being spawned by corruption just really don't drop much. They don't have any sort of unique currency or value that they really drop. They're just kind of extra slowdown. They just make maps slower. So instead I just came down and took another point over here to the side, fit for a king. So I got 25% rarity and 15 quantity on all the map bosses, and then +1 on all the zone levels, and then a chance for a waystone, and then who cares, a shrine, whatever. So that's what my tree looks like for the bossing tree. And so now I'm just going to jump into my results on the 100 bosses. It's really not a lot. I only counted drops that were at least a Chaos Orb, so around 5 Exalts at this point, at the time of recording. And so I have my raw currency over here on the left side. It's 4 Divines, 3 Annuls, 17 Chaos, 2 Orbs of Chance, and a Greater Jeweler's Orb. It doesn't seem like a lot, right? This is about 4.5 Divines, so yeah. Now, of note, I think that divs and annuls are an equal drop chance. We know from GGG confirming this in PoE 1 that exalts and divines in that game have an equal drop chance. So I would expect something similar in PoE 2 here. Divines and annuls have, I think, an equal drop chance or pretty close. That's definitely been my case with my currency tab. I have been pretty close on them, but because there's a very easy currency sink for divine orbs, divining good uniques to try and get a good result out of it, and there really isn't a great currency sink for annuls. They're just not worth nearly as much. So I didn't count the exalts that drop from bosses because they're so low value, but I averaged about 1 every other boss. So I would say I got around 40 or 50. I just didn't really think it was worth it. They're so low value and so volatile that I think it's better that I didn't count them. They've dropped in value relative to divine orbs by 60% since I've started this farm strategy. So if I were talking about this 3 days ago, they would have been basically twice as valuable as they are now, and they might be even less valuable in another day. Now, this may not sound like a lot, 4.5 divines over 100 maps, and it's not. But since we're only talking about bosses, and I'm estimating very generously that each boss took 30 seconds to kill, that's 30 times 100 divided by 60 seconds, that's 50 minutes to kill all 100 bosses. That's how much time that those bosses added to this strategy. And this is the amount of currency that they added, right? 4.5 divines for that 50 minutes worth of time. So, 4.5 divided by 50 times 60, that's 5.5 divines per hour added by adding in all these bosses in raw orbs. Now, I think that's decent, but wait, there's more. I did get a handful of decent high tier rare drops from the bosses as well, and while most of those were garbage, several of them were actually pretty good and sold for a bit of currency. There was 1 emerald that I sold for a raw divine, and then the rest I sold for, either 20 or 40 exalts apiece, which totaled up to be about 220 exalts here. So 1 divine, 220 exalts. At the start of this experiment, that would have been worth more than 2 divines. Now it's closer to 1.5 or 1 3/4 or whatever. It's still not bad. So all told, all of this sums up to be about 6 to 6.5, we'll say 6.5 divines worth of raw currency and rare items for less than an hour added by bossing. So again, 6.5 divines divided by 50 times 60, we're talking 7.8 divines per hour added by bossing. That's not bad. But there is still more. There's also waystones. Now, I didn't include them in this tab for two reasons. One, they wouldn't fit. And two, I've got more of them than I can ever use or sell. And, this right here, there's about not quite half of a quad tab. This is not even half of what I farmed in the course of doing this strategy. I also filled up 2 tabs and started filling another tab and emptied out and filled up this tab as well. Even so, bosses dropped around 2 to 6 waystones each. There were very, very few bosses that only dropped 1. So I would estimate the average drop rate on waystones per boss was around 3 to 3.5. I think 3.5 sounds probably better. So that's like 350 tier 15 waystones, which sell in bulk on the TFT Discord for around 70 waystones to a divine. So we could say that's another 5 divines worth of waystones if you want to go to the hassle of selling them and if that price holds up. So if we add all this up, just estimating 5 divines worth of waystones, 1.5 divines worth of item drops, and we'll say 4.5 divines worth of raw currency. Now we're looking at 11 divines, again in 50 minutes, which puts us at a total of slightly over 13 divines per hour added by doing bossing. So that leads me to my next question here. Is map bossing a good strategy? I think it's pretty good. It's not without downsides. Obviously, you have to like hunting map bosses, and you need to have a build that's good for killing them quickly. This is true for any strategy, and there are builds that aren't great at Breach, for example. But since that's the meta farm strategy, the meta builds in the game are exceptional at Breach. They can also just kind of drop nothing for several maps in a row. That's just how bosses go sometimes. I think across my first 10 maps, the only currency items that I got of any value at all was like 2 Chaos Orbs. And I was kind of ready to throw in the towel right at that moment, but I said, you know what, I'm just going to kind of stick with it. And then things started to pick up eventually, and then they wound up actually being pretty good. But you can just sometimes hit a big old streak of bad luck, and you have to be able to live with that. I also haven't included any costs either, to subtract from the 11 divines that this wound up netting, roughly. And if I were to do that, I bought, I think, about 100 Exalts worth of these Overseer's tablets and re-rolled those using the Reforge bench. I did also self-farm a bunch as well. I guess I technically could have sold those to other people, so maybe I could include the cost to those, but this isn't really a full-fledged farm strategy exactly. The price of each waystone also varied a bit, with some dropping pre-instilled, and some requiring me to install them with 3 paranoias like this map, right? So the price was anywhere from a self-found, essentially free waystone to about 11 Exalts worth of, delirium emotions. I would guess that I spent around 3 divines on the maps in total, counting the boss maps and the setup maps. I'm also not including any of the time spent actually running the maps, and that's kind of my real concern here. This strategy didn't take me 50 minutes to complete. It probably took closer to 15 hours to fully set up and run through to the end. But with that being said, I made about 100 divines, probably more, from all of that content combined without including the returns from the bosses. I farmed over 20 simulacra and 7 or 8 breach stones. I basically got nothing from any of the rituals, and I found, I think, about a dozen expedition logbooks along the way. I'm also not including the opportunity cost of doing this instead of just juicing breach on your maps instead, because that's kind of difficult to quantify. So ultimately, I do think map bosses are a pretty rewarding mechanic, more so than I had expected. Are they better than Breach? I think for most players, people playing meta builds, probably not. I do think they're better than Ritual Expedition or Delirium Mirrors, and they're not mutually exclusive with Delirious maps anyways, so that's not really a concern. More on that Ritual comparison, they don't require 4 King in the Mists keys to really max out the tree. That's, it's like 40 divines or whatever, and that's kind of another big point in favor of juicing map bosses. Capping out the Atlas passive tree for map bossing is really easy. You just kill map bosses at an increasing tier, then you kill the Arbiter of Ash 1 time, and you're done. Pretty easy. So if I were to change anything about this strategy, I think I would try playing around with more rarity, kind of like this tablet that I have here. Rarity, I think I would do that just to see if it resulted in more high value currency. That is to say, maybe some of the Chaos Orbs that I got would have turned into Divine Orbs or Orbs of Annulment, or, if I was really lucky, Perfect Jeweler's Orbs. That could have been pretty nice. I also think with Exalted Orb values plummeting, going for more rarity, essentially anointing more of my maps or instilling more of my maps with Greed for more rarity on them instead of Paranoia for more rare monsters, maybe would be a good move as well. It certainly would make things cheaper and easier since there'd be less deliriousness, and it would have helped for the purposes of this experiment by actually making the bosses drop a higher proportional amount of stuff in the maps compared to all of the extra rare monsters that the paranoias were adding. So in terms of what I think GGG should consider changing about bosses, I think the most obvious answer is the Crowbell fight. It's just not very good. And I think that's kind of a key to this as a functional strategy. If you're taking a couple of minutes to kill each boss, then this strategy isn't really that efficient. It wouldn't be very good. Other than that, I think some kind of distinct fragment or waystone drops from bosses similar to map bosses in PoE 1 dropping Shaper and Elder Guardian boss maps kind of makes sense, but it also kind of doesn't because of the way that the waystone system in PoE 2 works. I think adding a bit more juice onto the Bossing Atlas passive tree would maybe just be the most interesting approach, just making that quantity and rarity set of passives be like 50% each or something. There's a lot of very mediocre fluff in there, like the bonus Shrine and 30% corruption, 50% experience for map bosses. All of those are just kind of uninteresting. I would like more quant, more drops, more stuff from the bosses. Okay, I think that pretty much covers it. So in terms of what we learned, I think the main thing I learned was that map bosses drop a ton of maps. Yeah, that's probably the biggest thing. I do think map boss hunting can be a really good farm strategy if you're playing a build that doesn't handle breach very well, or if you're in an area with maps where breach is just really bad. And that is very useful. Breach could also get nerfed at some point in the future, but until that point, I think this is kind of a solid A-B+ strategy. Not the best, not perfect, but fun, good, and worth doing, and definitely worth remembering just in case. With that being said, I've spent several days doing this, so I'm definitely going to do something different for a little while. Probably Ritual. Be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video and want to see more like it. We're getting pretty close to 20,000 subscribers. It's a huge milestone for us. And if you want to support us even further, consider becoming a channel member. Alright, that's it. Thanks for watching and have fun bossing. Bye.